The successive publication of several international collections on video games as political tools has brought it home that to even the greatest doubters that video games are not innocent. They're political. And I'm not only talking about digital games that openly deal with historical or otherwise realistic political issues like wars, uprisings, strategic conquests, even the remotest fantasy worlds we may opt to interact with, and even the more abstract games that don't seem to depict actual humanoid creatures, they're all designed according to ultimately political values and assumptions about the world we live in. Although the actions we perform in them may be symbolical, simplified, and adapted to hardware controls, video games have rightly been called mirrors of society. What gets erased in them does not get activated in the player's imaginaries either. What gets shown will automatically be activated and foregrounded in us. That's just a rule of representation more generally. But also constructions of binary oppositions, right? And there are a lot of them historically in games, can evoke polarized thinking. At the same time, game worlds and the affinity spaces amongst players that they give rise to have been praised as educational supermedia environments, if you will, including for thought experiments like diversification, democratization, sustainability. And this is where this symposium starts from. To quote from our blurb, as interactive educational experience worlds, games are used by governments and paramilitary groups as propaganda tools and training simulators. Yet simultaneously, games can critically engage players in culturally specific and folkloric content, and thus pursue pacifist, democratic, and sustainability promoting goals. And this sounds a bit like a dichotomy. It isn't really, it's more like a spectrum, but it forms the basis of much public controversy. And there's no comprehensive scientific or scholarly understanding as of yet of how video games as folk worlds can impact intercultural understanding in anti and pro-social ways. So what we're aiming to achieve in the next couple of days is to flesh out some of the key concepts and methodological approaches that we consider part of a research program in video games as folk worlds and as tools for intercultural understanding. Looking at the program, the following keywords stand out for me personally: folk and folklore, worlds and worlding, nation, nationalism, nationality, heritage and tradition, colonialism and indigeneity, peoplehood, identity and democracy, trans-regionality and transculturality, materiality and sustainability, and more on a meta level, perhaps communication and education. And I trust that all speakers in the room can relate their research in some way to at least one of these bullet points. So over the course of the next 2 days, we'll be combining and entangling these and other concepts into a deep and dynamic rhizome, enriched with case studies and innovative methodological approaches. So to kick off the discussion, I want to share some aspects of my own emergent research on what I call folk mechanic and the ways in which indigenous video games, in particular, operationalize medium-specific multimodal designs to communicate relational values that can contribute to players' embodied learning about sustainable ways of thinking and living that connect regional experiences with transregional epistemologies. And because I don't identify as indigenous, and because I grapple to no small degree with the implications of inadvertently sitting on the colonizer's side, a position statement is in place. So the work I'm going to present is inspired by my experience of living and working between 2016 and 2020 on Treaty 6 territory in Canada, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dini, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. I humbly acknowledge that my research as a white settler scholar and uninvited guest was enriched by the traditions, history, and culture of diverse Indigenous peoples on and beyond Turtle Island. And I wish to honor the people whose learnings and storytelling traditions lie at the heart of this project. Any misunderstandings or misrepresentations are entirely my own, and I invite questions, feedback, and debate about my work that I've done as an outsider of the communities it focuses on. I also wish to thank Holger Pötsch, who's in the room, Zaida Kurt, and Thomas Spieß, the editor of the transcript volume Spielkritik, in which a German version of this paper appeared last month. They gave really, really valuable comments and insights, and an English version will become available later this year in the De Gruyter collection, Indigenous Peoples in and Video Games, edited by Anne de Leon, Ashley Bird, Nathan Laggis, and Wendy Sierra. So I'm going to, mention quite a few names, I guess, of people in the room, which is partly why I'm so excited about this opportunity. According to Bjarke Liboriussen and Paul Martin, since the mid-2000s, game studies has seen a, quote, regional turn marked by an increase in research conducted in and focused on areas outside of Western Europe and North America. This focus on localized game industries and play practices is reflected in major collections and monographs, the development of national and language-specific chapters of global organizations like DIGRA, the Digital Games Research Association, and many academic events and initiatives focusing specifically on national industries and player practices, like, for instance, the annual series Replaying Japan and its accompanying journal, the Replaying Japan. The decisively regional, in the sense of territorially and or nationally imagined focus of regional game studies has shown that the global games industry and the academic discipline of game studies has evolved to a degree that necessitates region-specific perspectives, reflecting the contextual constraints and contingencies of players, producers, and scholars. At the same time, it's become evident that games and their study cannot happen in a purely regional context because games, perhaps more than any other medium, tend to be designed for global audiences and are therefore regularly localized through culturally adaptive translations so as to align with certain cultural paradigms. So it's not just the language that gets translated, like entire concepts and world pictures need to be translated there. So to meet those expectations and meanings that differ from the cultures of origin. Also, games can operate far beyond entertainment and edutainment and become a political force that transgresses political and territorial boundaries. For example, in May 2023, 3 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the concomitant Russian censorship of anti-regime news outlets, the Finnish newspaper Helsingin Sanomat commissioned a counter-strike global offensive map called Devoina that includes a corridor to a subterranean bunker where players in Russia and elsewhere can access locally censored news coverage about Russia's warfare and especially war crimes in Ukraine. And therefore they can gain insights into like very direct and sort of, graphic insights into wartime suffering, the kind of messaging that gets semiotically erased, denied, or euphemized by state-governed media outlets. This goes to show that games as global supermedia can have targeted local and translocal effects that can cross not only political borders, but also those of fiction and fact, propaganda, and journalism. To account for these transversal effects, Claudia Derry, such as current used this term quite a lot, a complementary research agenda is needed, and this builds on what we've just heard from Maria Selig. An agenda that captures the polycentricity of our world, but also the artificiality of national and cultural borders. And I therefore propose the concept of trans-regional game studies as a subfield of digital area studies. And this is something we've begun to develop at Das Lab, which in German means the ultimate lab, which of course it is. Here in Regensburg, where we seek to refigure the colonially fraught traditional discipline of area studies that was born out of Cold War binaries and the need to understand the enemy as the political and cultural other. So we're obviously not the first to do this step. I mean, since the 1990s, with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the growth of digitalized society, social geography and cultural studies, new area studies approaches have emerged that revisit the concept of region, less in terms of bounded territory and more in terms of multi-scalar relationships and networks across nations, regions, local and translocal communities. The territorial view tends to emphasize hierarchies and fixed boundaries. The relational view, by contrast, sees space as constituted through an infinite set of multi-layered interactions. It contains the potential for multiplicity as an expression of social plurality, and it's constantly under construction. So to illustrate this approach, I've been doing some research into indigenous game design, representation, and play, which are bound up with questions of land, right? Land and more than humanness. Indigenous notions of space do not easily align with the territorial boundedness of settler colonial imaginaries. Land is seen as fundamentally transregional, and so are many of the values, traditions, languages, and other epistemological and practical aspects of indigenous cultures. By the way, I'm not meaning to essentialize or generalize indigeneity in any kind of way or deny the diversity and fluidity of indigenous and First Nations cultures, thank you, around the world. My case studies are on indigenous games, especially in North America, Turtle Island, and the Sami regions of Northern Europe. And I draw on indigenous published scholarship, which actually summarizes indigeneity in these kind of ways as well. A key connective tissue between transregional studies and indigenous epistemology is relationality. Broadly speaking, it refers to the ways in which spatially situated and individually contingent elements are entangled and rely on one another's nurturing support. While relational theories arising out of more Western institutional contexts tend to focus on intersubjective or interhuman relations, or the material entanglements between human and non-human entities, think actual network theory, for example, they have retained an essentially anthropocentric worldview that places humanity in a binary relationship with the non-human, right? But indigenous epistemology places relationality as a cosmocentric living practice front and center. Its ontology, and now I'm quoting from indigenous scholar Lauren Tynan, encompasses everything from ants, little creepy crawlies, memories, humans, fire, tides, and research, which stand in an equally weighted reciprocal relationship. Everything material and immaterial is part of a mutually contingent cosmology that connects its component parts in integrated non-hierarchical kinship relations. The work of Donna Haraway comes to mind there as well. According to Cree scholar Sean Wilson, relational thinking implies the acknowledgement that we all exist in relationship to one another, the natural world, in ideas, the cosmos, objects, ancestors, and future generations, and furthermore, importantly, that we are accountable to those relationships. And accountability as an inherently relational concept called Wakotowin, I think, implies the need to preserve and nurture cosmic relationships. Framed in this way, relationality functions as the core organizing principle of indigenous systems of knowledge, informing identity formation or peoplehood, ways of knowing. And those are very much, you know, like asking questions, listening to elders, observing, story work, creating lived experiences. Books do not necessarily come up in this list. Cultural expressions, right? Like artwork, songs, books, games, and institutions. And the ethical foundation of this epistemology is the so-called cradle of the 3 R's: respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. These are actually values that kids in Canada, even in non-Indigenous communities, you know, they're brought up with those quite explicitly, although they may not actually understand what they mean. But they're brought up that way. And those values and practices meant to protect future generations as they prioritize mutual care, protection, and support between all elements in the cosmic web. As an epistemological stance, this view can, quote, Little Tree, help unsettle the colonial mentalities shaping contemporary practices of knowledge organization. And importantly, for us as games researchers, indigenous relationality is inseparable from storytelling, right? And from the experience of, other worlds. And because it's learned from stories, watching our old people yarn and sitting with country. Oral storytelling and land therefore lie at the core of an essentially anthropo-decentric way of learning and knowing. So having introduced some key epistemological foundations, I want to make a first move towards introducing folk mechanics. And to do so, we need to establish what we mean by folk in the first place, knowing that Christian has got a separate paper just about what folk means in 2024. I'm going to keep it brief and stand to be corrected by anyone in the room. As I see it, in game culture, folk can refer to at least 3 phenomena. And I consider these critical, like to decolonial and post-anthropocentric game theory. Firstly, folk can inspire romantic and or biblical notions of nationhood, national identity, and in an extremist version thereof, nationalism, fascism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. Think of the German word Volk and its Nazi appropriation, right? In a longer version of this paper, I use Roger Calois, an important game scholar, and his concept of mimicry as a tool for conceptualizing politicized role play as manifested in nationalist appropriations of fantasy gaming. Again, a nod to Christian's work on Skyrim, Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Second, folk can evoke notions of left-wing activism, subversion, emancipation, and this conveys a revolutionary spirit that seeks independence from mainstream hegemonic forces by disrupting their structures and power mechanisms. And here I invoke again Calois' concept of ilinx or vertigo, which means a feeling of dizziness evoked by a self-induced loss of balance or control. In this respect, Jonathan Cohen has introduced the term third game culture in sort of aligning folkloristic games with third cinema, which was an artistic movement in the 60s of filmmakers that were sort of going against the consumer pressures of Hollywood. And finally, and most importantly for this paper, I reappropriate Calois' concept of agon or competition in the context of indigenous relationality. And here the folk concept primarily refers to folklore, but it transcends the representational dimensions that we know from other storytelling media, and instead allows us to explore the ways in which alternative ways of knowing might be embedded in medium-specific design principles. So taking these 3 notions as a starting point, here is my working definition of folk mechanic, which refers to the ways in which video games convey cultural and particularly ethnic and folkloristic messages, as well as elements of cultural heritage and memory through medium-specific systemic aesthetics, thereby providing players with key cultural insights and practices. The term is therefore based on the medium-specific procedural mode. This is a term that Jason Horlock uses, drawing on Ian Bogost. And this mode, it's basically doing stuff in a game. It's not just watching, listening, it's actually performing, actively, making decisions. And this allows players to learn and understand a game's key messages through ludic action afforded by procedural algorithms and embedded in other semiotic modes such as audiovisual and haptic representations. But folk mechanics can also manifest in paratextual metaludic actions that happen outside of the game proper, but are inspired by elements and experiences of the game world. Yeah, I will get there. So I think I'm going to skip this last bit and go straight to my case study. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how relational agon as a distinctly indigenous folk mechanic is integrated in games from and about the Arctic Inuit. Yeah, here, Anishinaabe and other indigenous communities from Turtle Island and Sami people from sort of Northern Europe, Sami or Sami land. I'm starting with decolonial unmapping, which relates to the ways in which traditional colonial navigation aids and mechanics in games are replaced with decolonial alternatives. So cartographic maps as navigation devices have been recognized widely as indispensable, right, in games. Maps represent game worlds iconically, symbolically, and they show players where they are at any given moment, where they need to go to perform tasks, and what props and obstacles they might encounter. Viewed from a post-colonial angle, game maps signify a colonialist stance that allows players to discover, unlock, understand, conquer, and dominate the land represented by the mimetic game world. As Souvik Mukherjee, who will join us later today, has compellingly argued, the very act of creating and using a map is an act of colonial violence, because it reifies power, reinforces the status quo, and freezes social interaction within charted lines. Needless to say, the charted lines of the colonizer do not generally align with the spatial imaginaries of the people whose native lands are thus appropriated and repurposed, right? So indigenous peoples tend to operate transregionally. They have different ideas of, land and territory. These borders are artificial and enforced on them, right? So the Inuit inhabit and hunt across large territories of the Arctic and subarctic regions of Alaska, Labrador, the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Quebec, and Greenland. Anishinaabe peoples live in the Great Lakes regions of Canada and the US, and Sami communities reside in the northern regions of Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the Kola Peninsula in Russia. So the schism between mapping as a key tool for players engaged in colonial agon and relational views of land as deterritorialized and non-mappable appears in the form, and this is my example, of non-playable or hardly playable cartography in Elizabeth Lapensé's Sovereign adventure game, When Rivers Were Trailed. Sovereign meaning indigenous, created, and inspired. So it's conceptualized as a decolonial response to the Oregon Trail, and it describes the journey of an Anishinaabe refugee from Fond du Lac through numerous indigenous and other minority cultures from Minnesota to California against the historical backdrop of government-mandated land allotment of the 1890s. On their way, the player character meets a variety of mostly indigenous people, groups with whom we exchange information and gifts. We enjoy their hospitality. We help them, they help us. We listen to their stories. And this player repository, which you can see across the top, quite sort of unconventional, right? There's food, medicine, well-being, and well-being is mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. And we have to manage this. And it's not like you're just hoarding. That's not going to work. You can't even hoard because there's only a limited amount of prey you can make at any point. So survival is possible through an appropriate mix of empathy, kindness, because you have to give as well as take, generosity, reciprocity, responsiveness, and relational decision making. So it's interesting that this bird's eye view, it's very hard to make out anything that would resemble a map as we know it, because it's more Western cartography. It's also kept in more earth and colors. You see mostly lakes, and like there are some labels, but there's no bigger settlements, right? There's no red, no real lines that mark territory boundaries. And we navigate by clicking on these directions, so we can't really decide exactly where we're going. It's a very limited way of proceeding, which of course marks the enforced nature of this refugee and their trajectory towards the West, because they're getting expelled and expelled over and over again. Here's my second example. So in many indigenous cultures, the drum plays a key role in dance, storytelling, and healing. And it's way more than just a musical instrument, right? It represents a connection with the spiritual world, symbolizes balance, equality, and often it becomes the focus of rituals such as powwows, round dances, and so on. And so here in this game, which is called Skama, Snowfall, it's a 3D adventure game by Finnish game studio Red Stage Entertainment, indigenous led. voiced in Northern Sami, one of the 9, I think, Sami languages and the most widespread. So you hear Sami. There is actually some English subtitles or any language really, but you hear it, which is beautiful, I think. So you play from the perspective of third person perspective of Ailu, a young Sami reindeer herder who encounters an ancient no-ID drum called Guavdis. And this drum guides him through his natural environment in search of a lost reindeer and of a cure for a destructive pandemic disease spreading among the wildlife around him. And sort of on his vast journey, and this is actually an open world game, and in open world games, you tend to have a map because otherwise it's so easy to get lost. And there's nothing that will help you other than your own probably rather rudimentary memory of what you've already seen and where you've been, because you can't orient it like you would in the natural world. You only have your camera, and then you have the drum, and the drum is auditive, so you hear it, and it shows you like in a more sort of transcendent kind of way where you need to go. And then there's familiar spirits as well, represented by animals that help you proceed as well. So I'm going to shorten what I was going to say a little bit and show you the third case study, which it's folk mechanic, which I called survivance through co-species collaboration. So relationality with other species, mostly animals, is key to indigenous game design, and it symbolizes survivance, which is like a blend of survival and resistance, and constitutes indigenous mentality and robustness in the face of colonial extraction and abuse. So this very basic form of interspecies cooperation is found in Nebralone or Kisima Inichunya by Upper One Games, which is actually the first indigenous-owned game company in the US, and works in collaboration with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. It's set in the Arctic landscape of northern Alaska and is based on the Inupiaq story of Kunuksayuka by Inupiaq elder Robert Nasruk Cleveland. It features the player character Nuna. Nuna is the Inupiaq word for land, a young girl trying to solve the mystery of how her village was destroyed. We begin in medias res in the middle of a blizzard where Nuna meets the Arctic fox, who you can see here. And Fox remains her companion. It doesn't have a name, it's important, right? To solve the mystery of how the village was destroyed and to bring back some kind of, again, equilibrium. So this interplay, co-op interplay is super essential. You can't do it without, even if you're single player, you have to switch between those two characters. And sort of, yeah, and Nuna learns from and with Fox how to both withstand and trust the forces of nature, represented by spirited beings. And this spiritual and physical development is captured in the word isuma, which means mental awareness, maturity, and intelligence in relation to how humans, like any other natural elements, need to learn how to sustain themselves in a natural environment whilst preserving and nurturing it. As Catherine Meloche, indigenous scholar, has argued, the game's structure as a whole makes Nebralone a digital simulacrum of the Karji, which is a gathering place of Inuit, where they learn from each other, but they play, they have gatherings and all sorts of other things. And I'm missing my last, no, actually, yeah, I think I'm missing my last, no, I'm not. Anyway, so, but the polar bear is not just any enemy that is kind of evil and always in your face. It becomes a symbol of this importance between protecting and guarding yourself from natural forces. It keeps coming back, so it becomes a bit of an idée fixe. And so it's a complementary symbol of power and vulnerability, and it represents a force that needs to be escaped, but also protected in a habitat that is increasingly threatened by climate change. So to conclude, in sovereign indigenous video games, techniques of folk mechanic bring about pedagogies of relationality, to quote from Kat Barnes, These pedagogies are characterized by a decolonial perspective on land and nature as the source and basis of life. And the media specificity goes beyond audiovisual representation and integrates procedural multimodal semiotics to convey relational values such as co-species respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. So video games become systemic environments for emergent experiences and embedded experiential land-connected learning and reflection. And I think I'm going to end it here and to allow some time for questions. Thank you very much.